In this video, I'm going to talk about career options in psychology, but also how to get into grad school and whether or not you should go to grad school in order to get a good job. It's often seen as a prerequisite in psychology to get a job, to go to grad school and get at least a master's, but that's actually not often the case. We'll get into that. So first off, attaining a BA in psychology. How many people are doing it? So psychology is actually a really popular major. You can probably tell just by the class sizes and how many classes are offered in psychology. But psychology is currently the fifth most common major. And I have statistics here from 2007, but also this is reflected in the later ones from 2012. So currently there are a little under 500,000 people in the US alone who are or basically majoring in psychology. Not all of these graduate with psychology majors, but many of them are trying to attain a degree in psychology. So psychology is right behind things like business, education degrees, liberal arts degrees, nursing and pre-med degrees, mostly biology and chemistry, in the popularity of all the majors. And it's something that's been really growing in recent years. So you can see big upticks, especially when psychology was first starting to take off in the 60s and 70s, and then again when therapy was becoming much more prevalent in the 90s. And since then, it's really just been steadily increasing. So in 2010, there was about 100,000 students who graduated with a BA or BS in psychology, and that's just 1 year. So that goes to show you that for about every year that goes by, there's about 100,000 more people with psychology degrees. So of those, about a quarter went off to graduate school. It often surprises people that it's only a quarter, because again, a lot of people think that they have to get a college or basically a master's or a PhD in order to be successful with psychology as a major. But of that quarter, about 80% did go into a master's or MS program, and about 20% went straight to a PhD or PsyD program. And we'll talk about the differences between those different types of programs in a little bit. And also, the prevalence of people going to grad school has indeed increased as well, especially again since about the 90s when we started seeing a lot more people going into counseling practices. Doctorates have remained pretty steady, but especially with master's degrees in psychology are becoming increasingly common. So as you can see, about 3 out of 4 psychology majors actually don't go on to grad school right out of basically their undergraduate education. So what do people do with just a BA in psychology? And I say that I don't mean to be derisive, but a lot of people think of a BA as being just a BA in psychology, as not being that impressive. But actually, there's lots of different jobs you can do with just a BA in psychology without having to get a master's or a PhD. The most common by far is management and administration. And actually, these are some of the best positions that you can have in terms of pay, hours worked, and amount of freedom in what you're doing. So a lot of businesses and big corporations like to have people who are psychologists or have some type of background in psychology to manage people. And this makes perfect sense since psychology is really the study of people. So oftentimes some of the best classes you can take for your psychology major are actually management classes. For example, social psychology deals a lot with how to work with people, group dynamics classes, industrial organizational classes. A lot of people are really looking for students who have mastered these types of subjects. The second most common is sales. Again, since you know how to work with people, hopefully you know how to sell to people. So a lot of people with psychology degrees end up in marketing, making commercials, advertisements, working to make stores more efficient. So for example, how to organize a grocery store to make people go more toward higher priced items. People can do social work with just a BA in psychology. It's a myth that you need a master's in order to do social work. You can have more power in your social work position if you have a master's. Basically, you can manage other social workers, but you can work for a social working organization just with a BA in psychology. There's also personnel and workforce training, basically HR or human resources, insurance, securities, real estate, business. There are many places. A lot of these are sort of sales occupations, especially with insurance and real estate, but many places where they like to have psychology degrees, marketing, also nursing. There are lots of places where they offer positions for nurses with a BA in biology, psychiatry, or psychology, pre-med, all that kind of thing. And then lastly, accounting and financial advising, which of course you do need some type of business background with that, or accounting, mathematical background with that. But again, they like to have people who know how to work with others for all these positions. And so psychology can be a great major for people who maybe don't necessarily know exactly what they want to do, but they just know that they want a position where they're working with people and probably directing them in a way that involves sales or management of some kind. So the types of graduate programs that you can pursue tend to be either research-oriented or applied. And what I mean by that is that, and this usually follows along also with a PhD versus master's, but most PhD programs are research-oriented. Basically, you are working hard to establish yourself as a researcher contributing to the field of science and psychology, or you're really working with patients and clients, maybe at a hospital setting or at a personal practice, in order to better counsel people. So like I was saying, most PhD programs are research-oriented, and most applied programs are either master's programs or PsyD programs. Of course, we'll get into what the difference between a PhD and a PsyD is a little bit, but they're both doctorate programs. Another thing to consider is that research programs tend to be only at Research 1 universities, which are mostly Ivy League schools or state-run universities. So the UC system is a good example. Also, of course, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, all these types of schools. Applied programs tend to either become from state colleges. So instead of UC Merced, for example, which is a UC, you could go to CSU Stanislaus. Or also at a lot of private colleges. That's especially where they offer PsyD programs. That tends to be one big difference between PhDs and PsyDs, is that PhDs tend to come from state institutions, PsyDs tend to come from private colleges. So what's offered at Stanislaus, a local college? Well, there actually is some nice opportunities just locally at Stanislaus if you're interested in getting a master's in psychology. For example, there's the MA program. It's not as popular as the other programs, but it's a nice one if you want to eventually get into a doctorate program, but you don't feel like you're quite ready yet, or you weren't accepted into any doctorate programs currently. So an MA program is where you actually set up a program with a teacher, a faculty member, so that they work as your advisor, and then they develop a curriculum program that you need to pass in order to attain your MA. And then usually it's directed toward any kind of research that you're interested in doing. So it culminates into a research thesis that you do at the end of your MA program. And if you do a good job, of course, you get your MA degree and hopefully go on to do PhD work somewhere else. A much more popular program at Stanislaus is the MS program in counseling. And this is all geared toward getting a marriage and family therapist license. Another version of this is the behavioral analysis classes or program, which also gets you an MFT. The biggest difference is that counseling offers a lot of different counseling tactics. So you'll learn behavioral techniques, but also cognitive techniques, humanistic techniques, all that kind of stuff. Whereas behavioral analysis is much more geared toward operant conditioning and classical conditioning to help alleviate bad behaviors. It's much more common to use a behavioral technique, for example, with children. So autistic children, children with ADHD, tend to benefit greatly from behavioral analysis types of counseling programs. So if you especially want to work with children, that might be a good program for you. Also, along with this is the MSW program. So this is something that is going toward licensed clinical social working licensure so that you can be a licensed social worker. And again, you can be a social worker with just a BA in psychology, but this allows you to manage people's cases and manage other social workers so that you get to be a little bit higher up in the company. So all of these involve 1 or 2 years of coursework and a thesis, and that's pretty common of all master's programs. So what does a thesis entail? Well, basically a thesis is where you conduct either original research or a research summary, depending on what program that you're in. So most often it involves you consuming and using, or basically employing research findings in order to come up with general knowledge or general statements about the current state of a topic in psychology. And so one part of this is you want to be able to critically analyze research findings and then be capable at least of conducting your own research, if not actually conducting your own research for a thesis. So the reason we have students do theses in order to graduate the master's is to demonstrate that they know their field, they know the current science of whatever topic is of interest, and usually it's a counseling topic, a counseling topic if they're getting their master's in counseling. And also it shows off your critical thinking skills, your ability to communicate, because not only do you write a thesis, but you also present it orally. And often you will present it at job talks if you go look for a job in any profession, especially anything geared towards research or counseling, or you end up going towards a PhD later on, you might need to even give a job talk for that. And probably more than anything, it just shows your determination to work really hard and to work hard on a project that lasts for a long time. Because in the real world, most projects take years to complete. And school is not really a good preparer for that, or at least not regular school, where each course only takes maybe 4 months. In this case, you're working on a thesis for usually about a year, so it shows your determination in working on long-term projects, being able to separate it in time and work on it a piece at a time, and to be determined enough to stick with it to the very end. And so a lot of people say, what's it like to do a thesis? Is it like really difficult? Is it, something I should be dreading? And really the short answer to that is no. A thesis is a lot like what we've been doing in Psych 3000. Basically, you pick a topic of interest, you do a lit review on it, so you review all the past findings on it, and you figure out hopefully what's not yet been known about it, and then you form a hypothesis and design an experiment to test it. And then you write up your results. So the only real difference is that a thesis is just more detailed, but you also get more time and more help in working on it. So it does take a lot of effort to do a thesis. It does take about a year to complete it. But by the time you even begin a thesis, in starting graduate work in general, you've taken Psych 3000 and passed it. And hopefully you've also completed 2 other research seminars, so a 3000 level and a 4000 level, which emphasizes writing. So at this point, basically, you've gone through the thesis steps about 3 times in preparing yourself just before you even get into graduate school. And then once you're in graduate school, you receive a lot of support from faculty and other students. So all the other students are doing theses along with you, and oftentimes people will work in groups to maybe get research done more quickly or to just help each other out with certain parts of the process. And of course, faculty are there to supervise you, to work out all the bugs, as I say here. And by the time you get to the point where you're writing up your thesis and presenting it, the faculty members are going to make sure that it's a good scientific paper, a good scientific topic and experiment or summary. And so they're really, their job is to make sure that you don't fail if you put in the work. So outside of Stanislaus, of course, there's lots of different graduate programs. Most of the MA programs across the board are there to help you with PhDs. And of course, lots of other programs do offer MSs, either in counseling or in social work. So if you want to get a PhD, you have one big choice you can make is whether to get a PsyD. Now, a PsyD is a doctorate program that emphasizes mostly in counseling, especially with private practice and work in hospitals. So if you want to go to a PsyD, the biggest reason to go is because you really just want to do clinical work and you don't want to have to bother with doing research on top of it. Of course, PhD programs, you usually be doing both. You usually be doing research and clinical work. Plus, you'll be specializing in something like mental health, which is most common. But you could also do neuroscience, social or cognitive processes, child development, behavioral genetics. There's lots of different sub-areas where you can get a PhD. Whereas PsyDs tend to be a bit more broad and just apply to counseling theory. So what do people with PhDs in psychology do? Well, I show here PhDs, but also it's pretty modeled equally for PhDs and master's degrees. There's not a whole lot of difference, so you can pretty much apply this to both. So most end up going either into counseling or some type of research. Probably the biggest difference between PhDs and master's students is that more PhDs go into research than master's students. Whereas here it shows about 35% of people going into counseling. For those with masters, it's more about 50%. A lot of people also still go into business or government. So even with a PhD in psychology, a lot of people choose not to end up being a counselor or researcher, even though that's usually the training they receive. So a lot of people end up in higher level HR positions or management positions. On top of that, about 6% go right into private practice. That's a little less common when you're first graduating because it's hard to have a good client base when you first start out. But as time goes on, a lot of people who start out counseling for maybe a hospital or a group home or some institution like this end up switching to private practice once they have enough clientele. And then about 8% go into school counseling. And this can include a lot of things. For example, it could include actually counseling students with mental illness. It could be supervising programs for people with learning and intellectual disability. It could also just be planning out the curriculum programs for regular high schoolers. So there's lots of also a big variety of opportunities in schools, either high schools, elementary schools, or middle schools for psychologists to intervene. So if you're interested in grad school, where do you start? What's sort of expected when you are applying to grad school? Well, one good place to start with is just good grades. So the average GPAs of people entering grad school in psychology is about a 3.5. And here the average psychology GPA, basically GPA from just the psychology classes, which is actually something that most programs pay more attention to than your general GPA, is about a 3.6. Now, don't worry if you have a GPA lower than this. Most graduate programs, even PhD programs, only require either a 3.0 or 3.3 in order to apply to graduate school. This is just the average amount of scores, which means that there are people who are getting in who have a GPA that are lower and higher than this. When it comes to GRE scores, you tend to find that somewhere around the 65th to 70th percentile is where you find the average scores. So for the GRE verbal, that's a 157, the same with GRE quantitative. With analytical, it's a 4.4 out of 5. So in this way, again, if you get a lower GRE or analytical score than this, don't worry so much about it because, again, usually the minimum requirements are much lower, and you get a big spread of people with different GRE and GPA scores coming into grad school. These are just the averages. And also, if you have a low GPA or GRE, this can often be made up with, for example, a really good letter of recommendation or maybe some extracurricular activities that you've been doing. So some other things to consider is getting a really good letter of recommendation. And in fact, if you can get 3 of them, that's perfect. But usually one really good one is what's expected, and then a couple of other ones, of course, you want to have to sort of fill out the requirements, because usually graduate schools will require 3 of them. So preferably you want a recommendation letter from tenured faculty members, usually people who've been working in the field for at least 10 to 15 years and have a good reputation. So if you can get with faculty who are doing research or clinical work on the side, that's all the better. That's usually not the case, of course, with lecturers who tend to just teach. So tenured faculty members make for really good letters of recommendation because they're working in the field in other ways besides just teaching. Although it can be a little hard to get classes with them because oftentimes they'll only teach maybe 1 or 2 classes a semester, whereas lecturers tend to teach somewhere between 3 and 5. It's really good, though, beyond even just getting a tenured faculty member, to get any faculty member that you know outside of class, especially anyone you've worked with maybe research projects or clinical work. So in that case, even if someone is a lecturer or a part-time faculty member, if you work with them outside of class on some project having to do with psychology, that can also be a really good letter of recommendation. So your recommendation letter should include things like description of your strengths, but also really detailed description of your past efforts, any work that you've done with them. How well you work with others is something that psychology programs are emphasizing more and more, because so much of psychology is turning from private practice, in which cases you're really just working for yourself, and many more are now turning to group practices, like research, but also working in hospitals, group home settings, this kind of thing. So there's a big emphasis and a big push in psychology to be able to work well with others. And also how you deal with obstacles. So if the person can provide specific examples of some type of project you were working on where you hit a bump in the road, and then you provided the impetus or the idea to get over that hardship or over that obstacle, that's a really great thing to add to a letter of recommendation. So of course you aren't writing this letter, so how can you be sure that the faculty member is talking about these things? Well, it's not necessarily a bad thing to hint at what you'd like them to include. Of course, you don't want to tell them basically you need to write about these 4 things, but you can say, hey, remember that time that we maybe hit this obstacle and I came up with that idea how to solve it, or I worked hard for a few weeks to solve this problem. If you could mention that, that would be great. And oftentimes when people want me to write a letter of recommendation for them, I'll outright ask for this. So I'll say, could you write me a little letter just about any past experiences we've had working together, your strengths, your past efforts, and all that kind of stuff. So either way, you want to make sure that this is included in your letter of recommendation, maybe even with a slight and friendly nudging on your part. Another really great thing to do is to get past experience, or basically extracurricular experience in your field. So if you are interested in doing research, or if you're interested in getting a PhD in general, you want to have some research experience even as an undergraduate. And this tends to actually be pretty easy to do. There are lots of people on campus, faculty members and graduate students, who are doing research all the time. So if you can work with a faculty member or graduate student doing research, that's a really great thing, especially if you're doing research either for the university or a private organization, so something that is getting grant funding. Also, if you can conduct your own research, for example, do a senior thesis, that also shows that you have research experience. Usually you'll have a faculty advisor on this, and so you can also maybe get a good letter of recommendation from them. And really the gold standard, if you can attain this, and this is kind of a harder thing to do, but if you can attain this, you're really doing a great job, is if you can get a paper published in your undergraduate years, or at least accepted for publication. So if you can do this, and this is something that still is few and far between undergrads or among undergrads, but if you can do this, this really shows that you have a strong research background, and it would greatly up your chances of getting accepted into graduate school. But maybe a more attainable research goal is to get a poster published. So in this doesn't require nearly as much work. Basically, you want to look for a convention that caters to undergraduate researchers. A really great one is Western Psychological Association, or WPA. They host a convention every year, and they tend to be on the cheaper side in terms of conventions. Usually it's about $70 or so to apply. And so what you do is you look for a convention you're interested in, and then go to their website and submit an abstract describing your research. So usually this is just a 200-word summary. And then they'll say either it's accepted or not accepted. And for the most part, especially with conventions tailored to undergrads, if it's a research project that seems legitimate and has good methodology, it'll be accepted regardless of the results. So in this case, you can go make a poster. Usually it would be about a 2 by 3 foot poster with your hypothesis, results, discussion, basically all the elements of a research paper that are condensed onto poster. And then you'll go and present that poster for an hour or so at the conference. And then beyond that, you get to watch other people's poster presentations and their colloquiums, which are basically talks. If you're interested more in clinical practice, then you can get extracurricular activities more on the clinical side of things. So for example, if you can volunteer or take an internship at a hospital or a counseling center, there are actually really great opportunities, even in Modesto, where you can work with autistic children with just 60 credits in psychology. So even at your junior standing, you can start working in the field and actually get paid for it. There's other opportunities like working for a suicide hotline, working for a Planned Parenthood clinic or any type of medical clinic. So there's lots of different ways in which you can work with people in a way that's extracurricular, that's maybe only part-time, but working with people in the field of psychology. Especially if you can go somewhere where you actually receive some type of training. So for example, as an undergrad, I worked with autistic kids, and as part of that, I received a 2-week training program in behavioral analysis. So that was a great thing to show on my graduate application that I'd had some experience in this specific type of counseling. And then the more populations you can work with, the better. So it's really good to experience with children, teens, seniors, families, people with serious mental disorder, people with maybe mild to moderate mental disorder. Any population that you can sort of add to your roster shows that you have a good idea of all the different populations that you can work with. And then the last thing, it's last and sometimes least, but not always, is the personal statement. The personal statement is kind of a hard thing because it's usually very open up to the person to discuss whatever they want to, and it's really up in the air about whether a graduate program really looks at it or not. Some research shows that some graduate programs, especially PhD programs, do tend to look at personal statements and weight them, but usually only to differentiate applicants who are otherwise very equal. With a lot of master's programs, sometimes it's more a formality than anything else. But since you don't know necessarily whether they weight them heavily or not, you always want to do a good effort on it. The biggest tip I can give to writing a personal statement is, of course, to answer any specific questions they may have in the application, but beyond that, talk specifically about what you'd like to do in their specific graduate program. The biggest mistake I see people make is to make a very general personal statement that mentions nothing about the specific college they're applying to. And the more details you can put in about the specific college being applied to, the better. Because the last thing a graduate admissions administrator wants to see is a really generic personal statement that they figure you probably have sent to at least 5 other schools. If you can mention specific faculty members at the university and specifically why you want to work with them, that's a great tip to them that you are actually interested in their particular program and know a bit about it and are prepared to do work there. And then also you want to be very realistic in what you can and can't do. So you don't want to go in and say something like, I want to revolutionize this field. You want to say, I want to work with a specific member on this specific research project, and it would be great if we could do a few publications out of it by the time I graduate. Also, just as a general tip, because I have read a lot of these letters of purpose, oftentimes people spend too much time talking about their past, particularly maybe why they got interested in psychology in the first place. And for the most part, it revolves around people talking to them about their problems or having a special empathetic relationship with those around them. And that sounds nice, but it's something that everybody writes about, and it's not very impressive. So what you really want to do is talk about specific job-related experiences, specific career goals that are attainable, and especially things that you can only do or say you can only do at that particular university, and that's exactly why you want to go there. So the more specific and career-oriented, the better. Now, when it comes to what people really look at, the letter of recommendation tends to top the list. So in master's programs, and this is coming from research that basically asks admissions administrators what kind of information they weight most heavily in deciding who gets admitted to graduate school. So for master's programs, 73% of administrators said that letters of recommendation are highly important. 69% said that GPAs are really important. And actually third on the list was statement of purpose. And then everything after that kind of is something that is 50-50 important or not important. And even things like clinical work experience, especially for a master's program where they don't expect you to have a ton of work experience, isn't rated as that important. So it's something that adds to your desirability as a grad applicant, but it's not something that's going to make or break you. The same with GRE scores. You notice that only about 40% of master's programs say that they rate GRE scores as highly important. It doesn't mean it's unimportant, it just means that they're going to consider your letters of recommendation and GPA scores above your GRE scores. When it comes to doctoral programs, one thing you'll notice is just that things are weighted more heavily. So for example, instead of 73% of master's programs saying that letters of rec are highly important, 87% of doctorate programs say they're highly important. But for the most part, the order of things stay about the same. You notice that statement of purpose is considered more important for a doctoral program, usually because by the time you apply to a doctoral program, you've usually had some work experience or some master's work, so you can write more about your past experiences in the field. Of course, GPA is still important, but especially for doctoral programs, past research experience becomes much more important. So usually in a doctoral program, they're expecting that you have done some independent research like a senior thesis or worked with faculty members on their own research. Also, interview becomes more important, rated as 63% of the people saying that it's important. So at that point, you do want to make a good impression in an interview, and basically you want to apply all the rules you apply to writing up your statement of purpose. Try to talk mostly about your goals at that specific university, your past work experiences, and of course, clearly answer any questions that they have for you. But again, the biggest differences between PhD and master's programs is that all the qualifications are just more highly rated. It's harder to get into a doctorate program, so they're looking more closely at everything you're doing. Also, research experience is much more important, and statement of purpose, interviews are more important, whereas GPA and GRE are relatively less important. And again, they're not unimportant. GRE scores are still considered by about 50% of doctoral programs as being highly important, but they're just relatively less important than your interview, past research experiences, or GPA. So what should you be doing if you're interested in getting into grad school? Well, the best thing to do is to start as early as possible. And don't worry too much if you're already a junior and you're thinking about grad school. There's still plenty of time. But if you are a senior and you plan to graduate in the next couple of semesters, you really, really need to be doing a lot of this stuff already. And maybe if you aren't, think about seriously taking some time off between undergraduate school and graduate school so that you can get some of this done and do it right. So as early as possible, and usually around your junior year, you really want to be considering this, try to get involved in some type of extracurricular research or counseling program. This is really good for getting job experience, but maybe even more importantly, it's good for getting really good, positive professional relationships with tenured faculty members. Because remember, both with master's and doctoral programs, getting good letters of recommendation were rated as the most important thing. Now, about your junior year, especially the later part, you want to be building up a list of graduate programs that you're interested in. And a good way to do this is to discuss this with faculty members. They usually have a good idea of what type of graduate programs would be good for you given your chosen lifestyle, where you want to live, what type of people you want to work with, and given your interests. Also, I would highly recommend doing a senior thesis even if you don't plan on going into a really research-heavy program. But especially if you want to get a PhD, a senior thesis is really a requirement. Most PhD programs won't actually look at your application unless you've done some type of senior thesis, And they're required at a lot of colleges. So even if you go to a college that doesn't require one, consider the fact that you're going to be competing with a lot of people who do go to colleges that require doing a senior thesis research project. So it's something to consider in your junior year so that you can get it done your senior year. And it tends not to be that hard. And actually, a lot of people find their senior research project really fun because it's on a topic of your choosing and you get to do it how you want to do it. So in fact, it's sort of one of those things where it's usually more of a passion project than something that seems grueling or too time-consuming. So by the summer before your senior year, so between your junior and senior year, definitely have a definitive list of the schools you want to apply to. If you're applying to master's programs, I would recommend having a minimum of 5 programs that you'd want. So maybe 1 or 2 that are your really hopeful, high hopeful, but maybe not likely to get into programs. A couple that are programs you definitely want to go to, but are more realistic given your sort of qualifications. And then at least 1 school, but maybe 2 that are sort of your backup. So if you don't get into anything else, you know you'll get into this school. And then it's really good to have some type of organizational method for applying to graduate school. This is one of the biggest headaches with applying to grad school is that every grad school has its own requirements, its own due dates, and its own checklists of things to get done. So one way to make this more manageable is perhaps making an Excel file or making a file drawer at home that has the specific requirements and checklists for each graduate school. And a lot of times things will be shared. So for example, most graduate schools are going to want their GRE scores, GPA scores, statements of purpose, letters of recommendation. So it's also a good way to go, okay, I've got my statement of purpose done, and that checks off, this requirement for, let's say, 5 out of the 6 schools that I'm applying to. So it's a good way to keep track of everything that is required for each school. And then it's also a really good time, if you haven't done it yet, to start studying for GREs. This is a pretty difficult thing to do because GREs tend to be very general. They're not that specific unless you take a psychology GRE, basically a subject-specific GRE. But a lot of schools don't even require that. So I would only do a psychology GRE if a specific school you're interested in is desiring it or wants you to do it. But the best way to study for GREs are probably to emphasize mostly the mathematical GRE, or to study mostly for that, because that's one where you can make a lot of progress on it by studying. And actually, just as a personal example, when I studied for my math GREs, at that point I hadn't taken a math class for many years because, of course, I was a psych major. The last one I took was a statistics class as a freshman, so I was really rusty on a lot of basic algebra and geometry. But I literally got algebra for dummies and geometry for dummies. I looked them over, I did a few practice problems to refresh myself, and ended up getting actually a really great math GRE score. So GRE scores on the mathematical side don't require you to do much more than basic algebra, geometry, and maybe a little bit of trigonometry, but nothing that would even require a calculator, just knowing some of the basic rules like the 2 sides of a right triangle are equal to its sloping side, or however you want to say that. But the verbal GREs are a lot more difficult to study for, primarily because they apply to verbal information, but also reading comprehension, and just things that in general you're going to have a difficult time researching specifically. So what I would try to do for a verbal GRE is to take the practice verbal GRE scores or test, and also you want to take the practice analytical test and the practice quantitative test too, just to see where you lie. But take the practice verbal one especially, and if you see any weaknesses, like especially with, let's say, word comprehension, then maybe you would want to pick up a book like Word Smart, where it teaches you basic vocabulary words that are common on GRE or an SAT scores, or tests, So in that way, there is some ways you can study for it, but it tends to be a lot harder to study for the verbal and also the analytical side of the GREs. So besides that, you also want to begin writing your personal statements. So why so soon? Well, a big thing is that personal statements are often something that's neglected till the very end of the application process, and people don't realize that they actually tend to take a long time to write. So you might think, well, it's only going to be 1 or 2 pages. How hard could it be? But the problem is that oftentimes you do have to write different letters of statement for each university, emphasizing exactly why you want to go to that specific university and work with those specific faculty members. So it does require doing your homework on that. But also, you want your personal statement to be basically flawless, to not have any grammatical errors, no spelling errors, to be very easy to read, very clear and concise. And so you want to start on it early so that you can work with the other people to write mini drafts for it, and maybe take it to the writing center at college, your local campus, and have them check it over, have your faculty members check it over, make sure that it's really, really a good letter of purpose. So then finally, when you get into your senior year, you can start off by taking the GREs. Try to take them no later than October, just in case you get some bad scores, you can retake it and still have time to do that before applications are due. And of course, begin asking professors or anyone else you're interested in for letters of recommendation. And I would try to get at professors at least 2 months before a letter is due, because people are very busy, and oftentimes it will take a little bit of reminding over the course of maybe a month for them to really begin working on it. So the more time you can give them, the better. Then into your senior year, later on in fall, you want to finish off and send up your applications. So deadlines for master's programs are usually right around February, ending in April, so usually in the spring semester, but deadlines for doctoral programs are usually a little earlier. So if you're only applying to master's programs, it does give you more time, but I would still keep the relative timetable that I've laid out here just so that you do have plenty of time to get everything done. And then in your spring semester of senior year, just wait for acceptance letters, and then visit colleges, go to interviews, and pick which college you want to attend. So that's kind of the nice thing is by the time you're done with your sort of halfway through your senior year, so by the time you're entering your second half, really all the major work is done and you get to see the results. And, worst case scenario, let's say you don't get into any graduate school or you get into a graduate program that you're not all that interested in, it's perfectly acceptable to take a year, maybe do some more internship and work in research or clinical practice outside of school, and then apply again next year. Maybe also retaking GRE or anything where you have lower scores. And actually, this doesn't reflect bad on you at all when it comes to graduate admissions. They really don't care if you've been out of school for just a year or two. If you've been out of school longer than that, that might be a problem. But a lot of graduate schools actually like for students to maybe take a year off, especially if they get some field work or some type of work within psychology during that time to better themselves for graduate school. So one big question, of course, if you're interested in getting a doctorate, and this could be right out of bachelor's or right out of your undergraduate years or after you get a master's, is whether to get a PhD or PsyD. So PhD programs have been around longer. They're based off what's called the Boulder model, which is based off of a conference, the Boulder Conference. Well, I don't remember exactly what year it was a very long time ago, where they basically laid out what should be emphasized in a PhD degree in, right, that's a little redundant, a philosophy degree in psychology. So what they decided is that the most emphasis or the heaviest emphasis should be on research, even if a person just wants to do clinical practice. And that's because all students, regardless of their career goals, will usually use research in order to basically fulfill their career. So even if the only thing you're doing is practicing with patients, you want to make sure that you have the latest knowledge and understanding of the psychology of science, the science of psychology. Did that a little backwards. So sometimes this gets criticisms because people who only want to counsel end up having to spend a lot of their time doing research. And the degree itself often hinges on the originality and quality of your dissertation. So that's a major criticism, is that a lot of people who are just interested in practicing with patients aren't interested in research and may be wondering, why do I need to spend at least 50% of my graduate time doing this research thing when really what I want to be doing is just working with patients? And oftentimes people will say, and I think rightly so, that if you're not going to be doing research in the future, it's still a good idea to know what research is and how to conduct it, but you don't necessarily need to spend, many years in some cases working on an original research project, basically a dissertation, if that's the only bit of research you're ever going to be doing in your life. So because of these criticisms, in the 60s, the Vail model came about. So this was an emphasis more on psychological services. And this was the impetus for the PsyD program, or basically psychology doctorate. So in this case, students spend the majority of their time actually working with other patients and clients. And they have to complete hundreds and actually usually thousands of service hours before they're awarded their degree. In these cases, usually people still do a dissertation, but it's much more of a paper reflecting your own service experiences and maybe any realizations you've had, something like that. So usually it's more revolving around your service to the community or to patients. Now the criticism here is that people who are beholden to the Boulder model say that in order to be a good clinician, you really need to have good experience working with research so that you can really qualitatively criticize good and bad research and be a good basically consumer of scientific findings in psychology. although this criticism is probably becoming less prevalent now that PsyD programs are gaining more respect around the country and around the world. So these PsyD programs are relatively new. They were first initiated at the University of Illinois in 1968, but they've since greatly grown in popularity. So when we look at the current number of accredited PhD and PsyD programs in psychology, we find that almost 30% of them now are PsyD programs. And as we look across the decades, we find that PsyD programs have stayed about the same in number around the U.S. Currently, there are a little more over 3,600 PhD programs in psychology offered in the U.S., and PsyD programs are starting to sort of catch up. And if this trend continues, probably by the time that, maybe in the year 2020 or so, a few decades have passed, probably there'll be about equal numbers of PhD and PsyD programs. And also these PsyD programs are growing in respectability as well. So when they first came out, you often had to get a PsyD and then get some type of extra schooling in order to have the same rights as those with a PhD. But that's not the case anymore. Since about the 90s across the US, it's been standardized that if you get a PsyD program that's accredited by the American Psychological Association, then you have all the rights and privileges of those who get a PhD degree. You still, of course, need to get your license for the whatever state you're working with in order to work with clients, but other than that, PsyD and PhD are equal. Well, even in that case, they're equal. You need to get a license in both cases. So there are some other differences, though. PhD programs tend to be on the smaller side compared to PsyD programs. So in a typical PhD program, you're going to have classes with just maybe 10 or 20 other students, and each class is going to have its own dedicated faculty member that works locally at the campus you're at. And so it's easy to meet with them during office hours, on research projects, counseling sessions, all that sort of thing. PsyD programs are typically physically located at a university, but often classes are offered online, especially for larger classes, which in some cases can be up to several hundred students. And usually they're taught by counselors, so just part-time faculty members who are usually working just part-time teaching and then the rest of the time in counseling services. PsyD programs are typically a little shorter, so PhD programs, especially now, tend to take about 6 years to complete, whereas PsyD programs tend to take only 3 or 4, because again, you're not doing a long dissertation in most cases. But one downside of that is that some people say that PsyD students are getting less training. And one bit of evidence for this is that PhD students tend to do better on licensure exams. But there are many other reasons for this potentially. For one, PhD programs are just a lot more selective in the student that they'll accept. Average PhD acceptance rates are about 20%, whereas average PsyD programs are more about acceptance rates of about 40 to 50%. So right there, that could really have a big effect on how people are doing on their licensure exams, just the selectivity bias. But also it is true that PhD programs tend to get more one-on-one time with faculty, have smaller class sizes, and have more demanding classwork. So it could be that there is some better preparation for your licensure exam if you're in a PhD program. But at the end of the day, as long as you pass the licensure exam, it doesn't really matter. All that matters is that you passed it so you can work with clients in your state. When it comes to acceptance rates, as you can see across the board, getting into master's programs is of course easier than getting into PhD programs, usually by a factor of about 2. So whereas, for example, in clinical psychology, only 17% of people get their, this is per university, get their letter accepted and are able to go. About 38% are accepted into master's programs. PsyD programs are pretty good with acceptance rates in clinical psychology, but as you can see, PsyDs really aren't represented in any other field of psychology. So PsyD programs tend to have an average acceptance rate of about 45%. For masters across the board, the acceptance rate is about 50%, and actually for this it's 54%. And for PhD programs, the average, if you average across all these, is 23%. Although that's a bit skewed by forensic psychology, which is a relatively new form of psychology. It doesn't have many people applying to it and thus has much higher acceptance rates. If you get rid of the 45% in PhD programs for acceptance rates, the probably more realistic figure is more around 15 to 20% acceptance rates for PhD programs. And so that's why if you're applying to master's programs, I suggest applying to 5 schools. If you're applying to PhD programs, I'd suggest applying to 10 schools, just to be on the safe side. Another thing to consider, especially when thinking about either a PsyD or PhD program, is how much financial assistance can you get. So usually with a master's program, they can assist you somewhat in financial financially in paying for tuition, but also paying for books, service, credentialing, all that kind of stuff. But usually for a master's program, you're going to pay at least about 50 to 80% of it on your own. But again, those programs only encompass about 2 years, so you're not looking at that much debt relative to what you might accrue in an undergraduate degree. But especially with a PhD or PsyD program where you're going to be spending the next 4 to maybe even 6 years of your life in this program, the debt can really rack up. So the sad thing about PsyD programs is that they by and large don't offer any assistantship when paying for them. This is because for the most part, PsyD programs are offered at private universities, and so private universities usually don't offer any state-funded or U.S.-funded stipends or tuition, what do they call it? Tuition forgiveness, I think is what they call it now. Whereas PhD programs often do offer more tuition waiving, tuition forgiveness, and oftentimes will even offer people maybe TA-ships or research grants in order to pay them on top of what they might be getting waived in tuition. So if you're doing a practice-oriented PhD program where the emphasis is more on hospital work, still about 50% of these programs, a little more than that, are going to offer oftentimes a full waiving of tuition fees plus some type of stipend, usually about $15,000 a year, so that you can pay for living expenses. If you're lucky enough to get into a research-oriented PhD programs, these are the ones with really low acceptance rates. Usually an acceptance rate for a research-oriented PhD program is right around 5 to 10%. But if you get into one, it tends to be pretty much a free ride. And this was thankfully my case when I got to UC Davis. It's a research-oriented PhD program, and they ended up paying my full tuition, plus I got to have a teaching assistantship, which ended up paying about $20,000 a year. So I had enough to live for living expenses. So I actually ended up accruing more debt in undergraduate schooling than I did for graduate school. But when you're looking at debt across the board for PhDs, you tend to find that most people accrue some debt. So on average, people accrue about $45,000 in debt for their undergraduate degree. And if they go on to grad school, they're looking to add at least usually another $40,000 onto that. But as you can see, about 39% of people fall somewhere in the $40,000 to $100,000 debt range, whereas only about 9% of people, most of these are in research-oriented PhD programs, have debt under $10,000. And then for those unfortunate few, they can rack up debt even over $100,000 just with graduate school. And then, of course, you have to add undergraduate debt on top of that. Now, this might look bad, and it is a lot of debt, but of course, this is you investing in your future. But if you look at PsyD programs, it's much, much worse. So PsyD programs, which again are mostly at private universities, it's very common to rack up debt over $100,000. And in fact, almost 15% of the sample surveyed in 2011 racked up debt over $180,000. So this is some serious debt that can be accrued by going to a PsyD program. And this is often the biggest reason to try to avoid PsyD programs if possible, which I think is kind of unfortunate because I think PsyD programs should be a good alternative for people who want to just do clinical practice. But at this point, they're so expensive that it really is prohibitive of actually getting a PsyD degree. Now, what's it like once you get into graduate school? And really, this applies to master's or PhD level grad school. The biggest thing I can tell you is it's really, really difficult. So, some people will say that it's easier to be in grad school than to apply to grad school, especially if you're going through the application process. You can think, man, how could it get into, any worse than this? But then, of course, you get into grad school and you realize, wow, this is a lot of work. So especially if you think that you're going to be working part-time or full-time plus going into grad school, really, I would say think again. Because grad school itself usually takes about 60 to 80 hours per week just doing coursework, working on your thesis or dissertation, working with clients, all that kind of stuff. So it is really impossible to work on top on going to grad school. And of course, that's why most people accrue debt. So even if you're lucky enough to attain a research grant or some type of teaching assistantship, you're only going to be making about $15,000 a year. So in that case, usually you'll accrue some debt even if your tuition is waived, even if you're working basically for the university, either on research or teaching assistantship and getting some money on the side. So all in all, it's kind of an anxious time in your life. You're not getting paid very much. You're usually accruing debt, and sometimes a lot of debt, especially if you're in a PsyD program. But also, there's the threat of not graduating. So when you're in a PhD program, usually about a quarter of people don't graduate with their PhD. These people end up dropping out. So it's not nearly as high as, for example, medical school, where in some programs up to 50% of people don't graduate, but still that's a pretty high number. So when you're entering in, you got to have sort of keep in mind that 1 out of 4 people that you're working with at that point aren't going to stay in the program to the end. And then there's also the threat that once you graduate, you might not find a job. And unfortunately, in today's economy, that's a very, very real threat. But what's it like to be in grad school? I just wanted to show you this is more of a farcical look at it, but there is some truth to it. But this is a little clip from Simpsons looking at, what's it like to be in grad school.
I'm going to talk to PhDs.
So what's the job outlook like for people graduating with either their master's or PhD or PsyD in psychology? Now, on the good side, there is more demand for psychologists now than there ever has been before. We've actually seen really sharp increases in the amount of jobs for psychologists since the 90s. So currently, there are about 174,000 psychology-related jobs in the U.S., and this has one of the highest increase rates of any professional career choice. So it's projected to increase by about 20% just in the next 10 years. So that should add another 40,000 new jobs by 2020. So actually, this is pretty good for most doctoral or specialist professions, especially when you consider things like architecture. What are some other ones that have been in the news lately for being really bad with job outlook? Computer analysis, because a lot of these jobs are actually starting to become automatized or outsourced. So psychologists are one of those things that would be really difficult to outsource a psychological evaluative job or clinical practice job to people in other countries. So this is one job that does tend to have really good increase rates in basically employment, or not necessarily employment, but just the amount of jobs out there. So that's sort of the good side of it. But unfortunately, there are just far, far more psychology majors than there are people, or basically jobs out there for psychology majors. So, this whole 174,000 jobs thing looks good, but you have to compare that to the fact that there are about 100,000 people getting their psychology majors or psychology BAs every single year. And then on top of that, there are about 25,000 getting MAs or PhDs every single year. So in this case, there just aren't enough jobs to go around. So this is why people who end up getting a degree in psychology often go into other fields like marketing, human resources, management, sales, this sort of thing. There just aren't nearly enough jobs to go around for how many people are getting their degree in psychology. And currently, and this is kind of a bummer, but it's true, psychology has one of the highest unemployment rates of all majors. Much more so than the more popular majors above it, but also much more so than most of the majors even below it in popularity. Clinical psychology is among the worst. So if you hope to become a clinical psychologist, realize that it has almost a 20% unemployment rate. There are currently about 20% of people with either a PhD or a master's in clinical psychology who are looking for a job in the field who can't get one. Educational psychology, and actually I'll just show some of the other ones here. So most of the other psychology types of careers still have an unemployment rate of about 10%, which isn't horrible, but they're all higher than the average unemployment rate for graduate students, which is about 9%. And actually, this is the same unemployment rate for undergraduate students as well. So whether you get a BA, an MA, or a PhD, usually about 9% of people, this is as of a couple of years ago, but it's remained pretty steady, are looking for employment but are unable to attain it. And so you might be thinking to yourself, wow, that's really bad, but it's still much better than not having a college degree. So if you didn't have a college degree at all, unemployment rates are about 23%. So it pays to have a degree in psychology, but maybe a little bit less so than having a degree, for example, in business, biology, accounting, things like that. And actually, accounting has become one of the top employable majors of this year. So it's one of those things, especially if you're thinking about going to clinical work, you really want to consider that you might be spending some years unemployed looking for a job, especially at first. And it is kind of sad that you can get a PhD in clinical psychology and have an employment rate that's not that much better than those with a high school degree. Another thing to consider is how much money you're going to be making, especially since a lot of people are going to be having at least $40,000 to $100,000 in debt just starting out. So if you want to work in academia, basically in research, The job outlook is okay in terms of how much you can make. It's a little bit above the median level. So if you're lucky enough to get an assistant professorship, it's about $60,000. The biggest problem with that is that only about 30% of teaching positions at universities are tenure track positions like assistant professorships. So that means about 70% of people are going to end up being a lecturer. And in this case, lecturers tend to make a little bit below the median income for the US. If you get a job at a research firm or a private research company, you can expect to make about as much as an assistant professor, so again about $60,000. And if you become a college administrator, which tends to be pretty rare for people who just graduate, but for people who maybe work in the field for a decade or two, oftentimes you can become an administrator and look for an increase in about $10,000, so up to about $70,000 starting as an administrator at a university. In a clinical setting, it's pretty much the same. So if you become a clinician, you're looking to make about $60,000 a year, a counselor a little bit less than that. The biggest difference being that a clinician usually has a PhD or PsyD level of education, whereas a counselor tends to have a master's level of education. And for school psychologists, they tend to fare a little better. So if you can work at a high school, middle school, or an elementary school, you're looking to make about $63,000. If you go into business, for example, administration and HR are the most common ones, you can look at an average salary of about $67,000. So you might be saying, well, that looks pretty good. So overall, with a graduate degree in psychology, you are looking to make about $60,000. Now, again, that looks good, but if you compare it to other majors, with most doctorates in other fields, the average is more about $100,000. And in fact, for most master's degrees in other fields, it's about $10,000 more than that. In fact, a little more than $10,000 more than that per year. So actually, if you look at how much people are making with graduate degrees in psychology, it's pretty much comparable to what people make with bachelor's degrees in other fields, which is about $58,000. So any way you look at it, you're going to be making probably a little bit more than the median income in the US, which right now is at about $50,000 to $55,000 a year. But still, you're probably going to be making way less than other people with your same level of education. And then, of course, another thing to consider, so you have a starting salary in these camps, usually depending on an MA, MS, PhD, or PsyD. But another big thing to consider is how much debt you might have on top of that. So if you get a master's, you're probably going to start working as a counselor, and especially starting counselors tend to make about $40,000 a year, and of course can get up to about $60,000 given a decade or two. But usually they have about $20,000 in debt. The biggest difference, or the biggest differential between how much you're making and how much you owe, are with the PsyD and PhD, especially the PsyD. So the median amount of debt for getting a PsyD is $120,000. And people with PsyD actually end up making a little bit less than people with PhDs on average. So if you're only making $60,000, if you could theoretically put all of that toward your debt, you could pay it off in a couple of years. But of course, you can't reasonably do that. So you're looking to pay off a significant amount of debt, akin to about half a mortgage payment, for usually about 20 to 30 years. So it is a huge cost to the person who ends up getting that degree. And of course, PhDs fall somewhere in the middle. So a big question is it worth it to go to grad school? So one thing, if the reason you want to go to grad school is to make more money, then you definitely don't want to go to grad school. It just doesn't make sense. And again, this might seem weird because most people say, well, don't you make more money with a higher degree? And that's true in most fields. So if we looked at the stats that I just showed before, across all the fields offered in undergraduate and graduate degrees, people tend to make jumps of about $10,000 to $15,000 going from one degree higher. So an average BA will earn you about $58,000, average MA is about $71,000, average PhD about $100,000. But the difference with psychology is that at different degree levels, you actually end up working in different industries. So usually people with a BA, the most common type of thing they enter into is management and HR, which actually has very good pay for the amount of work you're doing. So in this case, the average manager and HR person is likely to make about $78,000 a year. Whereas if you decide to get your master's, you're probably not going to work in management HR, you're probably going to work in counseling. And the average counselor in mid-income range is about $66,000. And that's also not, these figures, by the way, aren't starting, they're average for the career. So you're probably starting at about $40,000 and working your way up. Then if you get a PhD, you're probably going to either work in counseling or academia. Either way, you're looking at average income between $60,000 to $65,000. So actually, psychology is one of the few majors where people tend to make less with higher degrees, basically because they're working in different types of industries that don't offer as much money. Also, getting a higher degree doesn't mean you're going to have a cushier job. So for example, in the private industry, things like HR, management, sales, these things of course don't require any graduate degree. Usually you're going to be working an average 40-hour work week. And again, your median salary, especially for a lifelong career, is going to be somewhere between $60,000 and $120,000. $120,000 is definitely on the upper end per year. So in the upper end, you could be looking to make about $60 an hour, and on the lower end, about $30 an hour. Either way, that's pretty good. It's definitely above the median level. But the second you get your master's and start working as either a clinician, a researcher, or faculty member, and again, this can be with a master's or a PhD, either way, you're going to be looking at about 60 to 80 hours per week. Your median salary is actually going to be lower, from about $50,000 to $100,000 per year. And so on the upper end, you could be making as much as $32 an hour, which is only $3 higher than the lowest end in the private sector. And on the lowest end, if you're making just $50,000 and working about 80 hours a week, which is very typical for people starting out in these careers, you could be making as low as $12 an hour. So in this way, for the amount of time that you're working and the amount of money you're getting back, you could have a better deal working at a Costco or a Starbucks than working as a PhD clinician, an MA counselor, or a PhD researcher. And another thing to worry about, and again, it can seem like this is too early to begin worrying about it, but you really should be thinking about retirement even at an early age. And definitely people with higher degrees in psychology have much worse retirement. The biggest reason for this is that you start working much later in life. So if you begin working when you're just 22 years old, you have many more years to accrue some type of retirement than if you begin working when you're around age 28 or 30, which is much more typical of people with a master's or PhD. And retirement works on something called compounded interest. So basically it starts off with a small sum of money, and the amount of interest you get gets compounded. So the first year you might make 5%, so if you put in $100, you're going to get $105. But the next year you get 5%, you're getting 5% of $105. And the next year you're getting 5% of, let's say, $111. So it actually ends up that the money you make in the first 5 years of your employment ends up being about 20 to 30% of your total retirement savings. So you really want to add in money as soon as possible because you want to give that amount of money the most time to grow. So if you start working in the private sector, it means you're probably going to get about 5 to 8 years working before you reach retirement age. So if you start working at 22, you could be working 30 years by the time you're 62. If you start as a researcher, as a clinician with a PhD or PsyD, you'll probably start working at about age 30, sometimes even later. And so really you'll be about age, well, I got that a little screwed up because usually retirement is after 40 years of work. So again, 22 equals 62 after 40 years of work. But if you end up becoming a clinician or researcher, that usually means you're going to be about 70 by the time you reach 40 years of work and can maybe have enough saved up for retirement. So just to compare the type of retirements you have to look forward to if you get a BA versus a master's or PhD in psychology, if you get a BA and you end up working in human resources, and by the way, I use the CNN Money Retirement Calculator for this, so hopefully it's good. It is based off statistics by the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics, so it probably is a pretty good estimate of how things would go. But anyway, I just sort of plug these numbers as examples. So let's say you work in HR, you make an average lifetime salary of $78,000. So again, you'll usually start a little less than that and then work your way up. But you start your career at age 22, right out of college. For one thing, if you're working in the private sector for HR, you're very likely automatically enrolled in a 401k. This is a case where you basically contribute 10% of your salary and your company matches. And then let's say you retire at age 65. So you've been working, let's say that would be 43 years. Your retirement savings would actually be about $1.76 million. And hey, that sounds really good. Of course, we're going to adjust for inflation in a bit, which makes this not sound as good. But still, that's a good amount of savings. Also, you're going to get about $23,000 in Social Security, hypothetically, because, this is the year 2050, so who knows if Social Security will be around that long. But if it is, you'll be getting another $23,000 a month. And so your equivalent salary per year, or basically retirement income per year, is $111,000. And if you adjust for inflation in the year 2050, that'll be an average retirement of about getting $40,000 to $50,000 per year. So of course it's going to be less than you make, per year if you account for inflation. But by that time, you probably have a house paid off. You probably have many expenses paid off. You probably don't have any kids left at home anymore. So that's a pretty good retirement. That's pretty average, comfortable retirement to have. Now, let's say you decide to become someone working in academia, in research, in private practice, basically someone who's either counseling or doing some other type of work in psychology. Your average salary is going to be about $65,000. But again, in this case, I'm not even counting student loans. So if you count student loans, this would decrease the sum probably by about $10,000. But let's just say that you get out without any student loans, so the most optimum way to get through. Still, you're probably only going to start your major career at about age 30. And especially if you're working for private practice or an academic position, you're not going to be automatically enrolled in a 401k. So your best option is to enroll in a 403b. By the way, this is something only about 30% of people employed in private or academic universities do. And without enrolling in this, you literally will have no retirement savings. But let's say you do choose to enroll in a 403b. You can put in 10% of your salary. The company will not match it. So you're only getting 10% as opposed to 20% of your salary saved up. And so if you plan on retiring at age 65, hey, you'll have a cool million. But you got to remember, this million has to last you for about 20 years minimum. By the way, you're not rewarded Social Security because you haven't been paying into it this whole time. So again, if you're working for private practice or for an academic institution, you're not working in the private sector, you're not going to receive any Social Security. And so your retirement salary per year is only going to be about $50,000. And by that time 2050 rolls around, that's going to be equivalent to about $17,000 to $25,000 a year. So in fact, if you retire at age 65, having worked a career in counseling and research or in academia, you'll actually be making below the poverty line in most states with your retirement savings. So it's one of those cases where this is why often people who work in these fields end up working well over age 65. So again, the question is going to grad school worth it? Well, there are some good reasons to go into grad school. The main, not so good reasons is if you want to make more money. But if you love doing research or treating mental illness, then yes, you should go to grad school. You should do what you love regardless of how much money it makes you. Because studies show that after a median income of about $75,000, any income you make on top of that doesn't really increase happiness or life satisfaction. What increases it much more is doing something you love. So if you want to have a happy life, try to do something that you're really passionate about. A big caveat to this, though, is a lot of people love the idea of doing research or treating mental illness, but they have no idea what it's actually like on a day-to-day level. So I would strongly suggest interning with someone or having very long conversations with people who do counseling work or research and figuring out if this is a career that you'd want on a day-to-day level, because it is very, very grueling work and oftentimes can be pretty frustrating, especially working on research programs that might not pan out or working with clients that might not make progress, which more often than not is the outcome. Also, it requires that you work very hard, but there are a lot of people who like working really hard. So if you're the type of person who would just naturally want to work 60 to 80 hours per week, you're very career focused, you really enjoy working, and a lot of people, let's say a good describer of you is that you are quote unquote a stress junkie, then this is really a good work opportunity for you. Actually, that sort of goes to my next point. Because a lot of people who really enjoy being counselors, clinicians, researchers are people who are really driven, who would basically, whatever field they were in, would want to be working 60 hours per week, and a lot of people describe as stress junkies. So if that is you, that's one of those areas you really like sort of high stress, high stakes jobs, then this is a great field for you. So, one of the questions is, should you wait before going to grad school? And actually, it's being recommended more and more that people take a little bit of time off between their undergrad and graduate school training, mostly to figure out if grad school is right for them, and if so, what type of job they'd want. So it's really hard, I think, to gauge accurately what type of job or what kind of career you're going to want for the next 30 years based on your experiences as an undergrad, especially if you've had no work in the field whatsoever, if you've just been taking classes. So I often suggest to people, especially if they're not really sure about grad school, to take a little bit of time off. You don't typically want to take more than 2 years off if you do plan on going to grad school, but taking 1 year off can be a really smart move. And actually more and more grad schools are looking at that as a favorable aspect. So if you can take a year off, especially if you spend that year working in the field in some degree, maybe doing internships or working in lower level positions with counselors or researchers, that can look really great on your CV, so it can up the chances of getting into a really good graduate school, maybe one where they do help pay for you financially, but also it gives you a good idea, what is it day to day to work as a researcher or clinician? Am I really going to enjoy it? Also, like I said, it's a good way to work on your resume, and at the same time, you can look at other people who have gone out and gone to grad school. And so you can see, did it work out for them? Is it worth it for them, the extra amount of stress in order to get these jobs, which often don't pay any more? So it's one of those things that I definitely don't want to discourage people from going to grad school. I just want people to go for the right reasons. So if you're going primarily because you want to make money or because you feel like it's going to be a relatively easy job, then really you should not go to grad school in psychology. You should try to get many of the other types of jobs that you can get with a degree in psychology, especially given the amount of competitiveness there is in the market once you get a graduate degree. But if you really are passionate about helping other people in the sector of mental illness, about doing research and adding to the scientific knowledge of our field, then absolutely I would encourage you to go to grad school, but again with realistic expectations. So that's it for this lecture on grad school and just in general jobs in the field of psychology.